Guys, welcome back to Planet Mithril Paints, and today we are painting a classic metal sculpt from the Dol Amroth range, our first Dol Amroth model on the channel, Prince Imrahil. A beautiful sculpt, so much really well sculpted detail on the model, and it's really fun to get to paint that today for you guys on the channel. We're going to be using our first mix of Citadel and Scale 75 paints. The recipes for all the Scale 75 sections will be put in the descriptions with Citadel paints that you can use to replicate the same effect. As always, when we prepared our model, we trimmed off all the excess flash and we disposed of all the mould lines with a mould line cleaner and file respectively. We then affixed the model to the slotter base using super glue, and then once that was dry, we covered the base in fine modelling sand, let it dry, and then we primed the model with Citadel Chaos Black undercoat. So without further delay, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. First we're going to use Citadel Bugman's Glow and just apply a base coat of this all over his face and neck. Next we're going to use a mix of Rhinox Hide and Mournfang Brown, and once again just base coat all the hair with this mix. Make sure you pick out the strand of hair that falls down across his forehead, trying not to bleed over onto the Bugman's Glow base for the face. Now we're going to use a mix of Ironbreaker mixed with a very small amount of Lothern Blue, and we're going to very carefully just base coat all the armour plating all over Imrahil. You want to apply this in a few thinner down layers to get a nice smooth finish. Be very careful here not to add too much Lothern Blue because we don't want the armour to look blue. We just want to give that very slight hint of regality and the blue tone coming through from the undertones of the armour. This is what separates them from their Ministry of counterparts. Then we're going to use Lead Belcher and just pick out the sword blade with a few nice smooth coats either side. As well as applying a light dry brush to all the chainmail areas just to pick out the definition. As well as this, we're also going to pick out the shield bindings at the top and the bottom of the shield itself. Now we're going to use Scalecolour Mediterranean Blue for the bulk of the robes on Imrahil. You're going to want to dilute this ever so slightly and apply this in a few thin down coats just to make sure you get a nice smooth finish across all the robes. This is a really rich, vibrant blue which really fits the look of Dol Amroth that we're trying to go for. Make sure you get all the underside of the robes all between his legs and the robes that hang down by his waist as well. Make sure you wait for the previous coat to dry before applying a second one because we want to avoid any streaking or any blemishes in the finished base coat. We want it as clean and crisp as possible. And you can also pick out the shield outer, doing your best to avoid the insignia on the front of the shield, but don't worry too much if you do bleed over onto it at this point. Now we're going to use a mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Fleshtone and apply an all over layer all over Imrahil's face and neck. It's nice and smooth, picking out all the definition in his really well defined face. Now we're going to use Reikland Flesh Shade, thin down with some Lamia Medium, and apply this as an all over wash all over the facial area. This will just sink into the recesses, and as this sculpt face is really well defined, will create some really nice effective definition without an awful lot of work. Once the wash is dry, now we're going to relayer with the previous Bugman's Glow Cadian Fleshtone mix and just block out the larger areas of facial detail, leaving the wash showing in the recesses around the eyes, mouth and around his very well defined cheekbones. Making sure to get the definition on the chin as well for that Prince Charming, princely look we're trying to go for Imrahil. Now we're going to use pure Cadian flesh tone and push the layers further and just start layering over all the facial areas, leaving the previous layer showing in the recesses and around the hairline to create some nice depth and shadow and definition across his princely face. Areas to pay particular attention to are the cheekbones, the chin, the nose and the brow. Now we're going to use Cadian flesh tone mixed with some pallid witch flesh and just highlight the upper areas of brow, nose, cheek and chin, keeping your highlights nice and tight here so as to allow the previous layers to show through underneath and create a really nice progression of shadow through to light. Now we're going to add a bit more pallid witch flesh, which will bring your mix up to an approximate split of 50% pallid witch flesh and 50% Cadian flesh tone, and just apply an extreme edge highlight just to the most prominent areas of Imrahil's face. As we said, his face is extremely well defined, so these areas will not be difficult to locate at all for this application stage. Focus on the edges of the chin, the bridge of the nose, tip of the nose, the brow, and the most prominent parts of his very well defined cheek structure. Now we're going to use Scalecolour black and Scalecolour white for the eyes. With a fine detail brush, carefully paint in 2 horizontal lines of black in where the eyes are recessed into his head, being very careful not to bleed over onto the finished flesh. Now with Scalecolour white and a very good point to your brush, carefully put 2 dots of Scalecolour white either side of the black in his eyes to finish the effect. We can use a mix of Rhinox hide, Mournfang brown and Scrag brown for the first all over layer onto the hair. We want the hair to have a nice rich tone to it, which will be accentuated by the addition of Scrag brown here. So just make sure to get a nice all over layer as we did with the base coat, just to get that really nice rich chocolatey brown that we want for Imrahil's hair. Now we're going to apply a recess shade with Rhinox hide, thinned down to about 50% with Lamian medium, and we're going to paint this into the deepest recesses amongst the hair, just to create an initial sense of depth and shadow in amongst his flowing brown locks. There's some very well defined detail here, so it shouldn't be too hard to work out where this needs to go. Now we're going to push the shading further now with a mix of Agrak Thur shade diluted heavily with Lamian medium, and apply this as an all over wash to the hair. This will tone all the areas of hair that we haven't already shaded, whilst also providing more depth to the recess shade we painted in a second ago. Now with the previous Mournfang, Rhinox and Scrag brown mix, we're going to start separating out the larger chunks of Imrahil's hair, making sure to leave the wash and the shade showing in the deepest recesses. This will create a nice sense of movement initially, which we can work off really effectively for the next layering and highlighting stages. Now we're going to start adding Gorthor brown to the mix, and we're going to further push these highlights by concentrating on more of the individual strands of hair that curl around his head and fall down the back of his neck. You can start focusing on the outer curls and outer crests of hair in order to create a sense of movement and realistic look of light bouncing off his head as he runs into battle. Just make sure you've got a nice thin tip to your brush to make sure this application is precise as you can be, because the neater you are here, the better the look will be overall. Add more Gorthor brown to the mix, which will bring it to an approximate 50-50 split of Gorthor brown and the original brown mix. As we apply this here, we're focusing more and more on the tips, the curls and the outer edges of hair where the light will be hitting more prominently, once again to further push that sense of movement across his head. The neater you were with the previous stages will make this a lot easier in working out where your highlights need to go at this stage. Make sure we separate out all the individual hairs that we haven't yet and picking out that strand that falls down over his forehead without bleeding over onto his skin. Finally, we're going to apply a dot highlight with pure Gawthor brown just to the very tips, very edges and very outer curls of hair, just for that final spot colour of light hitting the absolute upper areas and outer areas of Imrahil's hair. This will just finish off the movement we want in the hair and give the final look that we want for this mane of princely hair for this hero of men. Now we're going to use Null Oil again, thin down with Lamy medium and paint in a recessed shade on all the armour plating. We want to focus on areas where the shadow would be more prominent than others, particularly around the neck brace, down the left hand side of the arm plating where the shield meets the metal, and around all the inner workings of all the armour creases. We also applied this shade to the chainmail and the sword blade. Now we're going to use Dragonhof Nightshade again with Lamy medium dilution and applying all over glaze to all the armour. This won't look terribly noticeable once you're doing it, but we found it really helped to just lift that subtle low-therm blue tone that we added in the initial base coating stage, and really helps the effect of the Dol Amroth armour pop just a little bit more in a very subtle, majestic way. Just all over the armour, nice and thorough, try and avoid it pooling anywhere to avoid any unsightly blemishes across the model. Now we're going to highlight all the armour with pure Ironbreaker, and we're going to apply this all over the armour, focusing more and more on the more prominent areas where light would be reflecting off the lighter areas of metal which are facing the light source. All around the edges of all the shin guards and shoulder plating, down the greaves, separating out the segmented boots at the bottom as well, and applying a nice strong highlight down the edge of each side of the sword blade just to create that nice sharpness. We've been using Ironbreaker here predominantly rather than Leadbelcher because we really want this armour to look bright and vibrant, really sharp and really regal, and we found that by using Ironbreaker as both our base coat and our layering paint, it really helps to capture the essence of Dol Amroth. Now we're going to use Ironbreaker mixed with some Pallid Witch Flesh and just apply a final edge highlight to the most prominent and sharp edges of all the armour plating. Painting a single long line down the front of the chest plate where it separates out to the lighter and dark halves, and picking out all the rivets along the shield and the most prominent parts of all the boots, greaves and shoulder and arm guards. Keep this nice and tight, nice and fine as you can, just to create that nice subtle hint of light bouncing off the most prominent areas of all the metalwork. We're going to use Scalecolour Viking Gold and just very carefully pick out the sword hilt gripped in Imrahil's right hand. Be very careful here not to bleed onto the sword, we don't want to get any unsightly blemishes on that. Don't worry too much about the glove at this stage, we'll be doing that in just a moment, but just a nice thorough base coat all over the hilt with Viking Gold. Now we're going to use a mix of Scalecolour Dwarven Gold and Scalecolour Elven Gold and just highlight the hilt. We're going to outline the shape of the pommel as well as the inner bracket and the crossguard, leaving some areas where we can shade in a second, and just focusing more on the upper areas of the metalwork around the sword hilt at this stage. Now we're going to use Scalecolour Necro Gold, thinned down with a little bit of water, and we're just going to paint this as a recessed shade into the inner workings of the hilt, focusing on the centre of the pommel, the inner areas of the crossguard, and focusing on any of the recessed areas over the hilt itself. Now we're going to apply a highlight with pure Elven Gold and further push the layers we put in with the Dwarven Gold Elven Gold mix, keeping them nice and tight, leaving the layers showing in the recesses and around the surrounding area, just to create that nice transition of dark metal to light metal over the pommel and hilt. Finally, we're going to apply a dot highlight of Citrine Alchemy just to the very edges and tips of the pommel and the crossguard,
Again, just to create that sense of light bouncing off the gold details. Now we're going to use Mediterranean blue with Scalecolour navy blue, thin down with water, and paint in a nice targeted shade all over the blue areas of the model. With the shield, you want to focus on where the metal meets the shield itself to create some nice shadow in between the metalwork and the shield front, and then painting this in across all the folds in all the material you can possibly find. Just all around the shoulder, just create that nice sense of rippled material all across his body. Again, this sculpt is very well detailed and the definition is extremely good, so finding where these shades need to go really won't be too much of a problem. But just be nice and thorough and make sure we get in all the creases and cracks of material around the cloak, between his legs, and in all the cloth down by his waist. Now we're going to relay it over again with Mediterranean blue, and we're just going to tidy up the cloak and the shield front for any shade that may have leaked over onto the rest of the cloak. This will also help to define more of the folds, as now we have our recess shade painted in, we can now start separating out all the individual folds and flow of the material as it falls down around his body. With all these, you want to apply this in a few thin coats just to make sure we maintain that crisp, even, smooth finish across the whole model and create a sense of uniformity. The last one we want is a blemished cloak. Just separating out all the creases, leaving the shade showing in the deepest recesses, and once you're done you will have a really nice natural looking shade to all the cloth and material on Imrahil. We also want to focus on blocking out the larger areas of shield, leaving the shade showing where the rivets meet the shield front, and trying to create some definition between the shield decoration and the main body of the shield itself. Now we're going to add some Scalecolour sky blue to the Mediterranean blue and start layering over all the cloth areas. We're trying to make sure we leave some of the Mediterranean blue showing around the edges as we layer this up to create that nice transition between the darker areas of material and the lighter areas of material. Focusing your layer and highlights here towards the apex and most prominent areas of cloth folds and creases, and give a really nice effective element of movement to all the cloth and material on this model. Again, thin down again in a few thinner coats, waiting for the previous coat to dry. If you're not happy with the finish, just go over again nice and carefully, being very careful not to let any of the paint pool up in any of the recess shading, which will otherwise spoil the effect we are going for here. The sky blue really helps to capture the essence of Dol Amroth in our mind. It creates a really nice, vibrant, bright blue, which complements well with the Dol Amroth paint scheme. And again, just focus a bit more on the inner workings of the shield, creating that definition between the darker areas and the lighter areas of the shield as it curves round the front of his body. For the next few highlights, you want to increase the amount of sky blue in the mix, and as we did before, just keep focusing on pushing these highlights more towards the most prominent and outer folds of cloak, just further reinforcing that sense of movement and flow across all the material and the shield outer. We did apply a few extra layers here, which we haven't shown in the video, mainly for time constraints, but each time add a bit more sky blue to the mix and continue the process, keeping your highlights tighter and finer as you go until you're happy with the finished result. By the time you finish these layering stages and initial highlighting stages, your mix should contain no more than about 75% sky blue to the Mediterranean blue undercoat, ready for the final edge highlight. For the final edge highlight, we're going to use pure sky blue now, and as we've been working up the transition by adding sky blue to the Mediterranean blue, this will really complement well and just help all the areas of cloth and blue on the model really pop. And we just want to keep this to the very edges and the very, very most prominent areas of cloth, just to finalise our sense of movement and give a nice transition between where the cloth bunches up and the more darker areas which are in the shade. So just very nice, very, very tight here. The last thing we want to do at this stage is to undo any of the work we've done previously. Well, we went for an Artist Opus size 00 brush, which took a bit of time to do, but we found with the very distinct point on the brush, it was very easy to get these highlights where we wanted them. With the shield, just apply a very, very fine edge highlight all around the outer and on the edges, just to make the shield pop a little bit more and help it stand out a little bit more against all the blue which is cascading in the cloth around it. Now we're going to use dryad bark and very carefully pick out the belt that hangs around his midsection, as well as the glove which is gripping the sword in his right hand, making sure to get all between the fingers and get a nice smooth even coverage. Now we're going to use dryad bark mixed with some Gawthor brown. Very carefully apply a layer over the top half of the belt and just framing out the bigger areas of the glove material, leaving the dryad bark showing in the shadow which is cast down by the hilt. Now we're going to use Agrax Earthshade thinned again with Lamia medium and just apply this as a targeted wash all over the belt and all over the hand, just to create some definition between the fingers and around the wrist. Now we're going to relayer with the previous dryad bark Gawthor brown mix, just highlight the glove, leaving the Agrax Earthshade showing in the recesses, particularly between the fingers, the area which is in shadow because of the hilt of the sword, and the underside of the glove. Finally, using pure Gawthor brown, we can apply a very fine edge highlight just at the top of the belt and all the straps on Imrahil, as well as a pinpoint highlight across the knuckle joints in the fingertips and around the very edges of the glove. We can use a mix of petroleum grey and rainy grey and very carefully base coat all the white areas on Imrahil. There is a swan decal on his shoulder, as well as the folds down by his waist, and of course the shield front as well, which has the swan in front of the boat. With a couple of thin coats, we want this to stay as crisp as possible to create a nice smooth finish for the white at the end. We're going to add some more rainy grey to the mix now and apply this as an all-over layer over all the white areas once again, just to lift the tone and make the next layering and highlighting stages as easy as we possibly can, as white is notoriously difficult to paint. Now we're going to use pure Scalecolour rainy grey and we're going to start layering over once again all the whites. We're not going to be applying a recess shade here, as we want to minimise the risk of any washes seeping into areas they shouldn't and spoiling our nice crisp clean finish. So you want to just very carefully separate out all the individual details along the shoulder decoration, the fold down by his waist, and blocking out now the larger areas on the shield front, leaving the previous petroleum grey rainy grey mix in all the recesses as much as you can, and starting to create some definition between the outer and inner areas of all the shield decoration. Now we're going to use Rainy Grey with Scalecolour White mixed in, and just go over all these areas again. You may want to slightly dilute this with water, not too much, so that it becomes too runny and therefore is unworkable, and also risks running into the recesses, which we really do not want to happen at this point. But thin down enough, just so you can work with it, and it goes over nice and smooth in a couple of thin coats, again, just to get that nice, crisp, clean, smooth finish that we want. Just very carefully all over the shield front. Take your time with a nice point to your brush. Make sure the paint goes exactly where you need it to go in order to get the best effect from the shield you possibly can. The white here creates a really lovely spot colour between the blue and the metals we've used so far. Finally, using pure Scalecolour White, we're just going to apply a very fine edge highlight now over all these white areas, just to make them pop that little bit more. You don't necessarily need to water this down at all. This is only going to be applied on the very edges and very most pronounced areas of all the decoration and details. But if you do, we recommend again not thinning it down too much so it becomes unworkable. Just make sure you keep a nice thin point to your brush, and just make sure we frame all the swan details, the sails of the boat around the outside of the shield decoration, and just stay as precise and careful as you can. Once you're done, you will have a really striking look to the shield decoration and all the white details on Imrahil. We're going to use dry bark now, and just with an old dry brush, just apply a thorough dry brush to all the sand on Imrahil's base. We're going to apply a second dry brush now, just with Gawthor Brown, slightly lighter than the dry bark one was, just so it leaves the base coat showing in amongst the recesses. And now with a super light dry brush now, we're just going to apply a very light dusting of pallid witch flesh, just to finish off the effect of our ground. We're now going to be decorating the base. We're going to be using 3 different things to decorate. We're going to be using Midland tufts, which are glued on with PVA glue, as well as some miniature dead leaves, which we put in small clumps around the base. And then finally, we're going to use a nice piece of clump foliage just to finish off our base. Once you're happy with how your base and your model looks, affix it to a paint pot with some blue tack, and just very carefully, with nice clean strokes, just paint the rim with dry bark. And there we have it, Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, ready to go and help his Minister of counterparts break the forces of evil. Dol Amroth for Gondor!